Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
The Rabbi Lion by James Platt. The clock of the Jewish quarter of Prague moves in the opposite direction to its brethren of the Christian town, yet each in its own way arrives second by second at the same inexorable facts of time. It was an hour short of midnight by both baptized and unbaptized reckoning. A misty rain was falling and mingled with the mist that rose from the river. Black obscure clouds veiled the face of the moon. Thunder roared at intervals. A flash of lightning that lifted momentarily the edge of the darkness revealed nothing kindlier than a gibbet. Dead bones that once had lived were creaking in its chains. The flesh had taken wing, the fowls of the air knew whither. Another flash showed a living man who crouched, smothered up in a cloak at the foot of the unsightly tree. This unhappy outlaw, if he dared seek no choicer shelter, was, perhaps, even more to be pitied than his brother above. Whatever his reason, he made no motion in the direction of a light that shone afar and presaged warmth and shelter. It was an inn. Its occupants concern us. They consisted of a company of half a dozen youths that had palpably imbibed both long and deep. Their carouse, however, was drawing to an end. The landlord hovered near, cogitating over his bill, and yet with an ear to the conversation of his guests, lest haply he might catch some word. In this he was unsuccessful, and no wonder. The language they spoke was not only foreign to the landlord, but was that one of all others of which the angels themselves are traditionally supposed to be ignorant. In a word, it was Chaldee. But how did these youngsters come to speak in the secret language of Kabbalah? The reason is not far to seek. They were students of the Kabbalah and of magic under a rabbi, one of the most esteemed of his time. The occasion they were celebrating with the flowing bowl was indeed no other than the conclusion of their 7 years' apprenticeship. So far, so good. But there was more in it than that. There was a death's head at their feast, something that necessitated for its discussion their gift of tongues, something that took the heat from food and made the red wine show white through their skins. Upon entering their course, they had set their hands in blood to the customary indentures of the magical schools of that period. After 7 years, so the bond provided, only 5 of the pupils were to leave their alma mater, their occult education complete. The 6th was forfeit to the devil, his due for acquiescence and assistance in their studies. A point on which the academies differed was the method of selecting among the apprentices which was to suffer as damned soul. Some held a kind of glorified race in which the runner that last attained the winning post was torn asunder by the fiend, but the rabbi who conducted the reading party in which we are interested had laughed at a decision made on physical grounds. The graduates should be chosen, he thought, not for fleetness of foot, but for the foremost quality of their sorcery. The scapegoat should similarly be thrown out not for unsoundness of wind or limb, but for the inadequate result of black art cramming. Logical enough, all this. There remained but to discriminate between the competitors. To do this, the rabbi had decided that on the morrow of the night when our story opens, he would hold a solemn incantation. It would be the first serious function of which the neophytes could boast. Their 7 years' candidacy had been occupied with theory, and had never ventured on practice. They would now find out the difference between knowing how to raise the devil and doing it, a difference which is even greater in this particular case than between word and deed in other arts and sciences. The idea of the rabbis was that, beginning gradually, the terror should be accumulated ever thicker and faster until it reached a point where one of the men would break. This then would be the victim to be forced instantly from his circle and snatched soul from body by the enemy. The reader is now cognizant of the mysterious business that fluttered these young hearts. We may add that their use of a dead language had another source besides the need for secrecy. No two of these ill-fated ones were natives of the same country. No two of them spoke a common speech. Such was the cosmopolitan fame of the rabbi at whose feet they sat, that he could pick his lads from Arctica to Cancer. We have already remarked that the supper drew to an end. The 6 had tried their manfulest to drown care, but they had found it impossible to get rightly drunk in the shadow of death and of hell. With despair for their toastmaster, they drank every time the health of the 5, and thought the more that they spoke no word of the eternal ruin of the 6th. The ruthless wretch outside was less to be pitied than these. They had discussed without hope every loophole of escape, and hopeless, rejected all. There was nothing for it now but to return home. The rabbi would never have allowed them out so late on any less momentous eve, but he had no fear of losing them, now they had run out their course of lessons. He had done his part. They had received their consideration. Trust him to look after his own, that keeps the tally of the damned. The reckoning had been adjusted to the satisfaction of the landlord by the chairman of the feast. That youth, who was apparently a Bohemian by birth, now led his companions out of the house which one of them was never to re-enter, and each turned back to look at it uncertain to what tune beggarly fortune next might dance. They proceeded in the direction of the gallows we have already alluded to. Rain was still falling. The outlaw had disappeared, but will turn up later in our path. As they approached the grisly standard, even the seasoned nerves of the sorcerers were troubled at the sight of its charge. They would have turned aside but for the Bohemian, who sturdily harangued them on their cowardice. "The devil walk arm in arm with you! Is this the way you stand to your guns at the sight of a gutted envelope, of a cast peas-cod, you that are due in but a few hours' space to outfront the root of all evil? I tell you the pit is digging deep for him that shows such favour then. But my liver is of another colour. What, fear a sloughed garment, and more rags than ribbons at that? Why, I only have to set my hand to it." The incident ended in a manner entirely unforeseen. The Bohemian had barely touched the corpse when it dropped on his shoulders. At this the other sorcerers, shod with fear, incontinently fled. The Bohemian stood his ground for only a moment. It had been in his mind that the thing would fall to pieces, but when he felt a burning breath and the bony arms closing round his throat, his brave soul shrunk like the kernel of a nut, and rattled against his sides. With the horrible revenant ever tightening its grasp, the Bohemian started to flee. In doing this, he followed in the footsteps of his companions, who made their way back to the tavern. The landlord was in the act of putting up his shutters when his late guests tumultuously helter-skeltered to his door, and shrieked for immediate rations of strong waters. Nothing loath, he planted them again at his tables, and exchanged their solids for his fluids. At this juncture the Bohemian appeared alone, but sweating to the very palms. He steadied himself against the wall, and drank off the landlord's proffer at a gulp. "Your health!" cried out a mocking voice from the very midst of the convives. The Bohemian dropped his glass with a crash that sowed its fragments wide. There was a stranger sitting in the midst of their company, and drinking as if one of themselves. No one had seen him enter. The host appeared as much at a loss as they were. But the unknown being obviously a man of mortal mould, the Bohemian soon recovered his wits. He challenged the unbidden guest. "Who are you, and why do you drink to me?" The stranger rose to his full height, which was more than common tall. We repeat that none of those present knew him, but to continue our practice of dealing fairly with the reader, we identify him with the outlaw with whom we commenced our story, huddled up at the feet of justice. This understood, we record the stranger's speech. "Walls have ears, and if you would know me, you must breathe the outer air. As to my drinking to your health between man and man, do you not look as if you needed it?" The obvious truth of this remark was only fuel to the Bohemian's fire. The more anxious on that account to know who the mysterious one was, he signed to his companions to come outside. The rain had now ceased. As they retraced, not without trepidation, the path they had so hastily left, they noticed that the gibbet was again occupied. But no one dared to ask the Bohemian how he had got rid of his unwelcome visitant. It was the stranger who renewed the conversation by abruptly mentioning his name. "I am Iron Harquin." His hearers started. They had expected nothing like this. It was a name proscribed, and upon which a heavy price was set. It was the name of the comrade, still at large, of him that shook a leg on the gallows. But Iron Harquin knew that these men were nothing to be feared. The affair of the dead bandit had given them their fill of thief-taking, at any rate, for that one night. The living might safely laugh them out of countenance about that exploit. He addressed himself accordingly to the Bohemian. "What, frightened with the rattling of bones that ride the gale? Would have me believe that the unpenitent thief descended from the cross? A sorrow on your fears! Take such tales to your confessor, for I'll have none of them, be sure. You had looked too long upon the jewelled wine, and that's the long and the short of it. I'll even touch hands with my dead mate myself, just to show you how unfounded your stampede. You will see no windfall vouchsafed to me, shake I never so shrewdly the tree." He suited the action to the word, and the event proved him right. The sorcerers would have turned tail at half a suspicion, but never a miracle occurred this time. The corpse continued to hug its chains. The Bohemian waxed wilder and still more wild, but he did not cease to listen to Iron Harquin. "Fear has no share in life of mine. Death has been all too long my fellow. Familiarity breeds contempt. I believe I could make the devil's pulse jump, could I only obtain an interview. That at any rate is the one thing left that might fathom the resources of my heart. I saved the life of a Hebrew once, who, in return, gave me lessons in magic. I never worked so hard in my life. I looked to shortly kiss the mouth of hell, but, as ill luck would have it, I quarrelled with my rabbi, and never found a chance." The Bohemian could scarcely help showing his incredulity, nor did he care much for the stranger's feelings. "What possible cause of quarrel could you have with a man whose life you saved?" "Cause enough for anything and everything, since he introduced me to his betrothed, and I fell in love with her. He poisoned her mind against me, and on a chance cast me into a well. The water, however, was sufficient to break my fall, and I escaped after starving many days. It was 20 years ago, but I have never been able to forget it. He shall yet curse the mother that bore him. I tell you all this frankly as I told you my name, because I know that you are not what you seem." The Bohemian followed this relation and chewed the cud of it. An idea had occurred to him fraught with unholy joy. He saw, as he thought, how he could achieve his own salvation at one stroke with the death of the intruder. How it worked out, we shall see in the sequel. This is how the Bohemian set it going. What do you mean by saying that we are not what we seem? Because although your outer man is clad in this world's uniform, your hearts are of the livery colours of hell. You are students of sorcery, and no later than tomorrow you are to conjure in your strength. Do I not read you rightly?" The Bohemian stared in something very much like stupor. Where on earth could the man have got his information? It sealed his death warrant, in any event. He knew too much for sure. The Bohemian by this time had matured his plans, which he now expressed in words. "Whatever your source of knowledge, you have hit us off correctly, I admit. Nor can we deny hospitality to such a man. We are within, as you say, a few hours of a magical ceremony. If you are so anxious as you pretend to face such odds, I will go so far as to yield my place to you." For the life of him, the Bohemian could not help something of a smile as he made this handsome offer. He was ignorant still whether the bandit was aware of the exceptional nature of this incantation. His reply would decide that point. If he knew the rules of the approaching contest, he would certainly refuse. If he did not, he could hardly maintain his fame without becoming a substitute for the Bohemian. To do him justice, Iron Harquin did not hesitate for a moment. "Your hand upon the bargain, man, and never fear but I shall do you credit. Since the beginning of recorded time, there shall have been no such conjuration. We will quench the light of adverse stars. Hell's idiom has no word for what we shall do." Still wearing the same sardonic grin, the Bohemian broke in upon his enthusiasm. His department was the practical. "Permit me to draw your attention to the fact that we have been drifting slowly on, and shall soon have reached the rabbi's house. It befits us, therefore, to arrange our order of business. It may not have occurred to you that the rabbi must know nothing about this. If he did, he might possibly veto the affair. But there will be no difficulty in circumventing him. The house is built square around a central court, where the conjuration will take place in open air. You will enter with us muffled in your cloak, and your presence will not be detected among so many. You will conceal yourself under the staircase, while the rabbi takes us to our bedrooms, which are the toppermost of the house. The old gentleman locks us in all night, for we are strictly looked after, I can assure you. When we are released, after a brief slumber, it will still be dark, and if I slip into your hiding place and you assume my authority, I do not see why the rabbi should be the wiser. As to the risk you run, that is, of course, more your affair than mine. I shall pray for you from my coign of vantage, if I can remember any but backward prayers. But now, confess, are you not moved at length with fear? Nay, by horn and hoof, I shall weather the devil as I have got the weather of death, and be hail fellow well met with both. At the worst a man can die but once. I had rather thus than a prod and a sod, like so many that I have sent to their account. And, to end all, is this your destination? Why, it is the house of Rabbi Lion. The Rabbi Lion is our teacher. The Bohemian was only too glad that the matter was thus settled. His fears for himself and of the other were disposed of in one ingenious coup. The remaining 5 sorcerers had followed the negotiations with mixed admiration and envy. From them no remonstrance was to be expected, quite the contrary, since they believed and hoped that the bandit, as a novice in magical matters, would be the one to pay penalty to the fiend. They had yet to find out that their dupe had more knowledge than they bargained for. Meanwhile, the Bohemian has knocked at the door. From within there comes a clangour of bolt and bars. The door is opened, and the rabbi appears. His pupils enter in as much of a hustle as possible, allowing Iron Harquin to conceal himself as arranged. The students file upstairs to be disposed of by their tutor, who will presently return alone. During this absence of the rabbi, Iron Harquin took by the forelock the opportunity of looking around. The courtyard itself was bare. The lofty walls of the house built it in on all four sides. Under the roof, 6 windows seemed to indicate the garrets of as many students. On the level of the ground there was nothing but 2 doors to break the monotonous courses of stone. One of these massive portals was that of the street through which Iron Harquin had entered. The other, which faced it on the opposite side, had been left ajar by the rabbi. It was, of a certainty, the passageway to his sanctum. The bandit approached it and looked through. A mighty chamber lay behind. The light which streamed from it into the courtyard was engendered by a central lamp, one of the sort which are traditionally reputed to burn with an everlasting flame. From the ceiling hung stuffed reptiles and other grotesques that seemed to shiver in the current of fresh air. Tables conveniently disposed for work were loaded with books and manuscripts. Every available niche and nook was piled with tools of necromancy that the bandit had no time to identify. Hearing the steps of the rabbi descending, he slipped to his covert just in time. The ancient Israelite re-entered his studio and slammed the door behind him. The wondrous light was thus extinguished, and the courtyard plunged in darkness. But not for long. The outlaw had scarcely disposed himself for sleep, better quarters this than the gibbet's foot, when the door was again thrown wide. He looked in the expectation of seeing once more the rabbi's workroom, but to his utter surprise and consternation, it was a different room altogether, though indisputably the self-same door. This time it was a lady's boudoir that was revealed, of immense size, imperially furnished, 1,000 mirrors flashing back its chandeliers. There was no trace of the rabbi who had just entered that very door. Instead, a beautiful girl of about 20 summers glided out to the cooling breeze. Had it not been for her, Iron Harquin would have been dumbfounded at the inexplicable shift of rooms. But the moment he set eyes on her, so much greater a surprise beset him that it drove all other out of mind. It was the woman of whom he had spoken to the Bohemian, the woman who had cut friendship and all but wrought his death, the woman whom he still loved. He strode forth without a second thought. "It is her very self!" he cried. The girl smiled at him as in recognition. Not the least surprise did she show at this strange meeting. She called him by his name. "Iron Harquin! You know me after all these years?" "Who better among men should I know, after all that passed between us? And did you not first know me?" "That is not the same thing. I am 20 years older, but you, I can hardly believe my eyes, are the girl of 20 years ago. Has time, too, been fooled by those eyes of yours, which I have often said would split a lover's coffin?" "Believe me, my friend, time's ravages are here, as surely as that you will never see them. It is your love now, as ever, that blinds your eyes and drapes a faded woman in your poetry. When I am dead and my body an ordinary for worms, you will see me still in fancy's eye, just the girl you see me now. And by the same token, you, that speak of being 20 years older, are in my eyes the brave and innocent boy whose lips were once my food." "Then you loved me all the time, after all?" At that age, what did I know of love or loathing? But the rabbi, "He is old," she cried, "past passion. Ah, Harquin, you would not know him now. I cannot make it out that you are still sweet and 20. Here is a waist would warm the arm of death. You are, if anything, lovelier, transfigured, haloed. You would hurry the pace of a star. Tell me true now, is it not some elixir of the rabbi's that has pinnacled you beyond the teeth of time?" She laughed. "Elixir of his? Why, he would swallow it himself, and to prove how little I lean on him, you may kill him if you will." "An assassination?" gasped the bandit. "The man knows no sword play." He was thinking as he spoke of the primitive device by which his rival had once tried to get rid of him. "A duel," returned the Jewess. "For if he knows no sword play, he can measure swords with steel they forge below. You are a tall man of your hands when knives are stripping, but at his trade you are the rabbi's fool. You will need all you know to join issue with him in ceremonial of magic. No later than this morning must you pit your strength against him, for to that you were decoyed hither." "Decoyed? I came of my own free will, for an adventure to my mind. The story's worth telling. I was dying for a sensation, so I decided to cut down a comrade and give him a more decent sepulchre than a gizzard. I had just got his corpse in safety to the ground when I heard a confusion of coming footsteps. Fearing it might be noticed that the gibbet was naked, I swung myself into the chains. I knew from their conversation they were magical students that had passed. I had a yearning to foregather with such once more, as I did in the days of my youth. A practical joke gave me the opportunity, and heaven be praised for the good hap. Iron Harquin was about to improve the occasion, but at this interesting juncture a howl of rage discharged through the upper air. It came from the head of the Bohemian, thrust out of his window. The Jewess snatched up the two hands of her lover and pressed them to her fervid lips. Almost before he was aware of it, she had retreated to her bower and closed the door behind her. At the same moment, the Bohemian, having wriggled through his window, leaped headlong into the courtyard. He came down unskilfully. Iron Harquin thought he heard his leg go. He lay there groaning, and then burst into invective against the outlaw. "The devil rough ride you that have seen so close a dream that I only sighted from afar. Bestride me the succubus, if I would have brought you hither, had I known she would come out to-night. The skies are dark as a wolf's throat, and I believe she only walked in the moon. Full many a night I watched it shine on her silken hair, silken as the touch of sin, long, so that when she unbound it, she stumbled in her locks. Her silver body was fragrant as the boundaries of hell. Death and dissolvement! Let me get you in my grips, and you shall never see her twice. Help me to my feet and unfold your blade, and then bite on what prayers you know." The bandit surveyed this unexpected rival with something very much like fellow feeling. Then he voiced the question that was uppermost in him. "How old did you suppose her?" "How old? What do I care how old? Old enough to be loved and to love." "How old did you suppose her?" "If you insist on it, I suppose she wears some 20 years, and a queenly garment they." "What? 20 years in your sight also? Why, I tell you this very girl is the one of whom I spoke to you, that I loved 20 years ago." "You lie, by the father of lies." The bandit clasped his hand to hilt, and as instantly snatched it away. "I fight with no cripple," he hissed in his teeth. "But you shall hear from herself God's truth." So saying, he ran his great strength against that door. Twice and thrice he rammed it. It did not flinch. He went back a few steps to acquire a fresh impetus, but before he could return to the attack it flew abruptly open, as if moved by some hidden spring. Iron Harquin uttered an astonished cry. The boudoir was no longer there. The mysterious chamber had undergone another protean change. To speak more by the book, there was no longer any chamber. The door framed nothing but blackest darkness. Neither ceiling, nor walls, nor floor could be distinguished. By this time the Bohemian had struggled to his feet, and now hobbled in the direction of the door. "Back! Back!" cried the bandit. "This is no place for you, nor for any Christian man. The foundations of this house are laid in hell. Back! Back! As you value your infinite soul!" "To heel!" shrieked the Bohemian, and he whipped out his sword. "Lest I strike you in the place where you live. This is my hour, and you shall not be the only one to take her between your hands." Before Harquin could forestall him, he had leaped the grinning door, and disappeared in enigmatical gloom. He was scarcely lost to sight, when a shriek rang out, beyond conception, awful. It was his death note. The whole air curdled. Iron Harquin fell upon his knees. What grimmest of riddles the victim solved, no man shall ever know. His body, even as his soul, was lost in that abysmal horror. For a while Harquin gazed at it, and saw no sign, nor heard what could be called a sound. It was a grave that gave up no dead. At last the outlaw rose and crossed himself, and closed the door upon its secret. Withdrawn to his corner, he set himself to think what monstrous enigma couched behind there. The worst of it was that it threw still more suspicion on the woman. But was she a woman at all? In his wanderings across Europe from sea to sea, he had never lost the Jewess out of mind. Whenever it was possible to acquire later news of her, he spared no pains to do so. But the gossip through which alone at such a distance he could keep himself in touch with her circumstances was always vague and even contradictory. He had been circumstantially assured of her death, and as circumstantially undeceived. But now he began to wonder if that report might have had foundation. To assume that upon losing her the rabbi had supplied her place with a familiar, culled from the females of the pit, would explain nearly all that he had seen. Was it woman or nightmare that couched behind there? He had arrived at no decision when the door again flew open, and he stretched out his head for the next development. But the panoramic capacity of the door seemed, for the time being, to have played itself out. The view was only the old one of the laboratory, out of which the rabbi stepped. He was loaded with apparatus of ceremonial magic. He deposited it upon the ground. He closed the wonder-working door. His next step was to trace out two enormous circles, one within the other. The outer one embraced the whole area of the courtyard. The other one ran inside it at a distance of about a yard all round. Between the circumferences of these two circles he inscribed 7 smaller ones at equal distances apart. The outlaw, who, though disappointed at the drying up of the resources of the door, watched all these proceedings with attention, perceived that the 7 circles were intended, one each, for the rabbi and his 6 attendants. He concluded that the ill-starred Bohemian, as having been undoubtedly cock of the school, would be assigned one of the 2 circles next the master, which was precisely the post Iron Harquin would have chosen. He was in some doubt, however, as to whether there might or might not be a miscarriage when the bedroom was found to be unaccountably empty. Fortunately, the rabbi, after placing a pan of living coal in each circle, went upstairs to unlock each door, and came down again at once without opening any. This may have been intended to allow time for his disciples to dress, but he bore as well the air of one having forgotten something, and ran as fast as his ears would permit him to that door of doors. The outlaw noted, as the rabbi passed through, that it was the boudoir this time visible. Apparently the thing worked round in a cycle. The rabbi emerged again almost at once, with a look of considerable relief. All this was Greek to the onlooker. The 5 candidates now appeared and took up the circles pointed out to them. The outlaw pulled his hat well over his features and, as it was still dark, hoped to pass muster. He saw, as he had expected, one of the places of honour was left for the Bohemian. He boldly took his stand there. He had now burnt his boats, and must go through. The rabbi had not yet syllabled a word, reserving his strength for the strain to come. He silently divided among his assistants the remainder of what he had brought out of his storeroom. This consisted of civet, amber and musk, of benzoin, camphor and myrrh, of every fragrance that wizards burn. The rabbi then stepped into his own circle and commenced a preliminary prayer. The supreme moment had come. A sudden glow invaded the veins of the amateur exorcist, late Iron Harquin, as he heard that well-known voice. Bit by bit, as he warmed to the work, he remembered the ritual which this very man had once been at pains to teach him. From time to time the other 5 chimed in with the responses. Iron Harquin dared not risk the recognition of his voice. As the ceremony proceeded, the air seemed to grow more dense until it became a matter of difficulty to breathe. It was thickening with, as yet, invisible elementals. Anon the outlaw's attention was drawn to the glances of his fellows, which timorously sought the empty space enclosed by the inmost of the 2 circles. He was somewhat dashed, even he, to see that this empty space had shrunk below the level of the courtyard. Worse, it continued to sink until it disappeared altogether. The magicians now stood in their 7 circles around the circumference of a well. Even this was not the worst, as the bottom, though out of sight, must still be sinking, and would sink to the very confines of the underworld. Connection was to be opened with the bottomless pit by means of this bottomless shaft. Having arrived at this by no means engaging conclusion, Iron Harquin had only to wait for the end. It came with a sudden smother and smoke that belched from the mouth of the chimney. The rabbi threw instantly perfumes upon his fire, and his acolytes did likewise. Essence and quintessence fought desperately with the evil odours of this smoke that came straight from eternal fires. And there was borne up with the smoke a weird hubbub of voices that blasphemed in every tongue. Cracked lips of the damned shrieked execrations in languages long dead, whose accents unintelligible made hearts stand still. In vain the rabbi raised his voice that had never ceased from the first onset. His exorcisms were drowned in oaths both loud and deep, and with the rush and roar of furnaces stoked with blood. And now the thick air showed faces that peered in their eyes, and gibberings that were not faces, creeping and crawling things. The outlaw's skin had long ago wrung out its last drop of sweat. The rabbi's white hair stood all on end. The moment for the trial had come. Iron Harquin threw his hat out of the circle, where it was instantly torn into a million shreds. His face thrust abruptly into the rabbi's line of sight. He roared in tones of thunder, "Rabbi Lion, I am Iron Harquin!" The effect upon the rabbi was electric. His eyes started out of his head. The chant died away upon his lips. He dropped like a stone into the pit. One long, low moan reverberated from side to side, broken up by peals of hellish jubilee. A terrible voice that hushed all else cried out 3 times, "Lost! Lost! Lost!" This was the climax, and Iron Harquin the man to bear the brunt of it. No help was to be expected from the 5 sucking sorcerers. They were ridden to rags. The last events had crowded so quickly together that the outlaw practically took up the litany where the rabbi had dropped it. He gave it such voice as would have been a surprise to the others, were they in a state to make the observation. The fact is, Iron Harquin was drunk with the cup of revenge. For 2 pins he would have bearded the fiend. The infernals shrunk from the lash and lather of such magnificent rage, expressed in the highest terms of art. They of the pit sucked in their smoke and hushed the outlet of despair. The centre of the courtyard reappeared, air refined itself, victorious sweet scents flung wide their banners. "Go in peace to your place. Peace be between us and you. Be ready to come when you are called." This final formal leave-taking of the spirits, without which no magician worth his salt would ever abandon his circle, wound up what had once looked like a serious business. The 6 could now quit in safety the circles which a moment before had been their only bulwark against perdition. The students were too limp to pay any attention to the giant that had taken their world upon his shoulders. Their little remaining sanity was all bent to the desire to get away from an accursed house. They stumbled out of the front gate, which the outlaw had to open for them, and scattered to the 4 winds of heaven. The cost being now clear, the bandit made for that other door, which had played so many parts. On what would the curtain now arise? He opened and discovered the boudoir, a repetition of its last role. The cycle theory was thus effectively disposed of. There was nothing for it but that the door obeyed some arbitrary will, scarcely its own. The rabbi was dead, and worse. There remained then only the Jewess. But where was she? The chamber had no outlet. She could in no wise have left it. Our hero ransacked every corner. He upset and set up and upset again every priceless piece of furniture, tore down silk and satin, and threw jewels underfoot, ground beneath his heel the command of armies and the price of the honour of queens. At last his eye was arrested by a common glass bottle. He was fascinated by it. He held it to the light. He all but dropped it. It contained the object of his search. Yes, there was no doubt now of the death of his former love. No doubt but that the rabbi's diabolical art and craft had replaced her by a familiar spirit. This was the receptacle in which he confined the familiar at seasons when he was not in need of her. This was the familiar herself within the bottle, reduced most delicately small. She still wore the guise of his long-lost wife with which her master had endowed her. She still caused a pang to the iron heart of Harquin to see her down to such poor prison. And she knew her power over him. She knew that he would find a way. She smiled at him divinely. She clasped her tiny hands in prayer to him. But he was aware that he must needs release her. He neither thought nor would have cared that, now her master was dead, once released, there was no controlling her. It just had to be done. But how to set about it? The stopper was sealed down, and with a talismanic character on the seal. It was the uttermost secret of the rabbi. Iron Harquin could not read it, and without reading it he could never open the bottle. There remained but one avenue of escape. The bottle must be broken. With all the strength of his iron arm he dashed it to the ground. There was a tremendous explosion, a roar like thunder, a flash before his eyes. Not a mirror in the chamber but was shattered and scattered. A rapidly enlarging female form escaped from the shards of the broken bottle. It lost as it enlarged all resemblance to the well-remembered Jewess. It became indefinite. It thinned into little more than a mist. It gradually disappeared. Yet as the last waft of it brushed his face, the passionate lover thought he felt once more his sweetheart's lips. But he looked around and saw himself alone with solitude and wreckage and desire of death.
How He Left the Hotel by Louisa Baldwin. Read by Dandy Dan. I used to work the passenger lift in the Empire Hotel. That big block of buildings and lines of red and white brick like streaky bacon. Stands at the corner of Bath Street. I served my time in the Army and got my discharge with good conduct stripes. And how I got the job was in this way. The hotel was a big company affair with a managing committee of retired officers and such like gentlemen with a bit of money in the concern and nothing to do but fidget about it. And my late colonel was one of them. He was as good-tempered a man as ever stepped when his will wasn't crossed, and when I asked him for a job, "Mo," he says, "you're the very man to work this lift at our big hotel. Soldiers are civil and businesslike, and the public like 'em only second best to sailors. We had to give our last man the sack, and you can take his place." I liked my work well enough and my pay and kept my place a year. And I should have been there still if it hadn't been for a circumstance, but more about that just now. Ours was a hydraulic lift. None of them rickety things that swung up like a pole parrot's cage in a well staircase that I shouldn't care to trust my neck to. It ran as smooth as oil. A child might have worked it, and safe as standing on the ground. Instead of being stuck full of advertisements like an omnibus, we'd mirrors in it, and the ladies would look at themselves and pat their hair and set their mouths, and when I was taking them downstairs dressed for an evening. It was a little sitting room with red velvet cushions to sit down on, and you'd nothing to do but get into it, and you'd float on up, and you'd float you down, light as a bird. All the visitors used the lift at one time or another, going up or coming down. Some of them was French, and they would call the lift the ascenseur, and good enough for them in their own language, no doubt, but why the Americans that can speak English when they choose, and are always finding out ways of doing things quicker than other folk, should waste their time and breath calling the lift an elevator? I can't make it out. I was in charge of the lift from noon until midnight. By the time the theater and dining out folks had come in, and anyone returning later walked upstairs, for my day was done. One of the porters worked the lift till I came on duty in the morning. But before 12 there was nothing particular going on, and not much till after 2 o'clock. Then it was pretty hot work, with visitors going up and down constant, and the electric bill ringing you from one floor to another like a house on fire. Then came a quiet spell while dinner was on, and I'd sit down comfortable in the lift and read my paper. Only I mightn't smoke, but nobody else might neither, and I had to ask foreign gentlemen to please not smoke in it. It was against the rule. I hadn't so often to tell English gentlemen. They're not like foreigners that seem as if their cigars are glued to their lips. I always noticed faces of folks when they got into the lift, for I have a sharp sight and good memory. And none of the visitors need to tell me twice where to take them. I knew them, and I knew their floor as well as they did themselves. It was in November that Colonel Saxby came to the Empire Hotel. I noticed him particularly because you could see all at once that he was a soldier. He was tall, thin man, about 50, with a hawk nose, keen eyes, and a gray mustache. And he walked stiff from a gunshot wound in his knee. But what I noticed most was the scar of a saber cut across the right side of his face. As he got in the lift to go to his room on the 4th floor, I thought, what a difference there is among officers. Colonel Saxby put me in mind of a telegraph post for height and thinness, and my own colonel was like a barrel in uniform, but a brave soldier and gentleman all the same. Colonel Saxby's room number was 210, just opposite the glass door leading up to the lift. And every time I stopped on the 4th floor, number 210 stared me right in the face. The colonel used to go up in that lift every day regular, though he never came down in it but I'm coming to that presently. Sometimes, when we was alone in the lift, He would speak to me. He asked me what regiment I served, said he knew the officers in it, but I can't say he was comfortable to talk to. There was something standoff about him, and he always seemed deep in his own thoughts. He never sat down on the lift. Whether it was empty or full, he stood bolt upright under the lamp, where the light fell on his pale face and scarred cheek. One day in February, I didn't take the colonel up in the lift, and as he was regular as clockwork, I noticed it. But I supposed he'd gone away for a few days, and I thought no more of it. Whenever I stopped on the 4th floor, the door to 210 was shut, and as he often left it open, I made sure the colonel was away. At the end of the week, I heard a chambermaid say that Colonel Saxby was ill. So I think that's why he hadn't been down the lift lately. It was a Tuesday night, and I had an uncommonly busy time of it. It was a stream of traffic up and down, and so it went the whole evening. It was on the stroke of midnight, and I was about to put the light in the lift, lock the door, and leave the key in the office for the man in the morning, when the electric bell rang sharp. I looked at the dial and saw I was wanted on the 4th floor. It struck 12 as I stepped into the lift. As I passed the 2nd and 3rd floors, I wondered who it was who rung so late, and I thought it must be a stranger that didn't know the rule of the house. But when I stopped on the 4th floor and flung the door open to the lift, Colonel Saxby was standing there wrapped in a military cloak. His room door was shut behind him, for I read the number on it. I thought he was ill in bed, and ill enough he looked, but he had his hat on. And what could a man that had been in bed 10 days want with going out on a winter midnight? I don't think he saw me, but when I'd set the lift in motion, I looked at him standing under the lamp with the shadow of his hat hiding his eyes, and the light full on the lower part of his face that was deadly pale, the scar on his cheek showing still paler. "Glad to see you better, sir." But he said nothing. I didn't like to look at him again. He stood like a statue with his cloak about him, and I was downright glad when I opened up the door to let him step out into the hall. I saluted as he got out, and he went past me towards the door. "The colonel wants to go out," I said to the porter who stood staring. He opened the front door, and Colonel Saxby walked out into the snow. "That's a queer go," said the porter. "It is," I said. "I don't like the colonel's looks. He doesn't seem himself at all. He's ill enough to be in bed, and there he is, gone out in a night like this. Anyhow, he's got that famous cloak to keep him warm. I say he's going to a fancy ball and got that cloak to hide his dress," said the porter, laughing uneasily, for we both felt queerer than we cared to say. And as we spoke, there came a loud ring at the doorbell. "No more passengers for me," I said. I was really putting out the light this time when Joe opened the door, and 2 gentlemen entered, and I knew at a glance they were doctors. One was tall, and the other short and stout, and they both came onto the lift. "Sorry, gentlemen, but it's against the rules of the lift to go up after midnight." "Nonsense," said the stout gentleman. "It is only just past 12, and it's a matter of life and death. Take us up at once to the 4th floor." And they were in the lift like a shot. When I opened the door, they went straight to number 210. A nurse came out to meet him, and the stout doctor said, "No change for the worse, I hope." And I heard her reply, "The patient died 5 minutes ago, sir." Though I'd had no business to speak, that was more than I could stand. I followed the doctors to the door and said, "There's some mistake here, gentlemen. I took the colonel down in the lift since the clock struck 12, and he went out." The stout doctor said sharply, "It's a case of mistaken identity. It was someone else you took for the colonel." "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, it was the colonel himself, and the night porter that opened the door for him knew him as well as me. He was dressed for a night like this, his military cloak wrapped around him." "Step in and see for yourself," said the nurse. I followed the doctors in the room, and there lay Colonel Saxby, looking just as I'd seen him a few minutes before. There he lay, dead as his forefathers, and the great cloak spread over the bed to keep him warm that would feel heat and cold no more. I never slept that night. I sat up with Joe, expecting every minute to hear the colonel ring the front doorbell. Next day, every time the bell for that lift rang sharp and sudden, the sweat broke out on me and I shook again. I felt as bad as I did the first time I was in action. Me and Joe told the manager all about it, and he said we'd been dreaming, but, said he, "Mind you, don't talk about it. or the house will be empty in a week. The colonel's coffin was smuggled into the house the next night. Me and the manager and the undertaker's men took it up in the lift, and it lay right across it, not an inch to spare. They carried it into number 210. While I waited for them to come out again, a queer feeling came over me. The door opened softly, and 6 men carried out the long coffin straight across the passage and set it down with its foot towards the door of the lift, and the manager looked round for me. "I can't do it, sir," I said. "I can't take the colonel down again. I took him down at midnight yesterday, and that was enough for me." "Push it in," said the manager, speaking short and sharp. And they ran the coffin into the lift without a sound. The manager got in last, and before he closed the door, he said, "Mole, you've worked this lift for the last time, it strikes me." And I had, for I wouldn't have stayed on at the Empire Hotel after what had happened, not if they doubled my wages, and me and the night porter left together.
Back to the Beast by Manly Wade Wellman. From the Smith City Mirror, June 26, 1927. Police are searching today for Dr. J.E. Lawler, well-known physician and scientist, following a report from his secretary, James Brock, that he had disappeared from his home at 2100 Van Ness Avenue. According to Brock, Dr. Lawler locked himself in his private laboratory 12 days ago, ordering his servants not to disturb him, and to send food down by means of a dumb waiter. As he had followed this plan several times before while working on experiments, Brock complied with his request. The time set was 10 days, and when there had been no response from the laboratory during the 2 days following the elapse of this period, Brock feared some accident, and with the help of George Dmitri, Dr. Lawler's cook, and Emile Bonner, his chauffeur, he forced the door this morning and found that the doctor was gone. A weird angle is added to the incident by the dead body of a large ape, which Brock found in a corner of the disordered laboratory. Although Dr. Lawler was known to be interested in natural history and to have conducted several experiments with animals recently, Brock stated he was sure the ape was not in the laboratory when it was closed 12 days ago. The table was covered with papers, which have been turned over to the police. Dmitri and Bonner are held for questioning by Chief of Police John Walton. Dr. Lawler has no immediate family. A brother, Stanley Lawler, of Topeka, Kansas, has been notified. From the Smith City Mirror, June 28, 1927. Attempts to determine the species of the ape found dead in the laboratory of Dr. J.E. Lawler, who disappeared last Saturday, were unsuccessful when Professor F.W. Baylor, head of the Natural Science Department of the State University, said today that he had never seen such a creature before. "There are 8 kinds of anthropoid apes known to science," said Professor Baylor, "but this ape belongs to none of them. It has some of the characteristics of several, but resembles no single kind greatly. It is either a freak or of a species unknown until now." Professor Baylor has ordered the animal embalmed and intends to send it to fellow students of natural history in Chicago. From the Smith City Mirror, June 29, 1927. James Brock, private secretary of Dr. J.E. Lawler, 2100 Van Ness Avenue, was placed under arrest today to face charges of kidnapping and possible murder of his employer last Saturday. The arrest took place following the reading of papers purporting to be a journal of an experiment performed by the doctor, which Brock turned over to the police upon his employer's disappearance. Brock had been held for questioning but was given his liberty Saturday. The contents of the journal were not made public, but Chief John Walton described them as preposterous and unbelievable, a forgery by Brock to cover a very evident crime. Extracts from the papers given to police by James Brock is the journal of Dr. James Everett Lawler. June 15th. All is in readiness for my experiment, the final step in my great work that will afford scientists a true glimpse of how man appeared in the dim past. The narrow persons who refused to believe in evolution will be forced to see the truth, for we will confront them, not with theories but with proofs. I have material now that would fill a great book, notes telling how I first discovered the combination of elements that induces deterioration and of my experiments with it. First on the lowest forms of life, then on more complex animals, with surprising and enlightening results. Years have been consumed in this study, but soon they will be paid for when I reveal what I have learned. The elements for the 2 serums, products of nearly a lifetime of labor and observation, are at hand. One serum is the deteriorator, which, when properly mingled and administered, will make vital changes in the organs and tissues of an animal. Changes which finally result in giving it the appearance of its ancestors untold ages ago. This change can be arrested by the administration of the counter-agent, which will restore the transformed creature to its former condition. I do not suppose that any person less determined or less scientific in mind than I would dare perform this experiment upon himself. But after all, it is as safe as such a thing can be. I have studied its effects and powers too much and too long to go wrong now, and I know that I shall not be mentally incapable of handling it. The change is physiological, not psychological. Foretelling the course of the whole process is a mere matter of rationalization. As I plan it, I will let the deteriorator work in my blood for 5 days, then the counter-agent for 5 days, to make sure that the effects of the experiment are completely dissipated. Thus I expect to see in my mirror what my ancestors were like 5,000 centuries ago, and then return to the body and semblance of Dr. Lawler, all within 2 weeks at the least. I have locked my door for 10 days. Brock, a sound, sensible fellow who obeys my orders without questioning, will see to it that I am undisturbed. And after this private experiment, I shall present my findings to my fellow scientists as the proof of their theories. Who can say that my name shall not be numbered with those of the great evolutionists? June 16th. For 24 hours I have had the serum in my blood. With what care I compounded it and injected it into the vein of my arm, you may well imagine. The effects were noticeable at once. My blood flowed faster, and for a few moments I felt strangely light-headed, as if I had been drinking. This latter feeling passed away, and I perspired freely but felt no unpleasant sensations. Throughout the day I have taken notes on the progress of the experiment, and tonight my mirror shows me that it is a success. The change in my appearance has not been so great as I expected, but it is very evident. I am florid and ruddy where I have generally been pale. I am far more robust, and all over my body my hair has grown out, especially on the breast and shoulders and outsides of the arms, a strange condition for me, always smooth-skinned and of late years partly bald. I never felt better physically in my life, and I look not the fine-drawn and slender scientist, but a full-bodied, really splendid savage. In excess of well-being and in joy, at the certain fulfillment of my expectations, I danced and leaped up and down this evening. Then, a little ashamed of myself, I sat down to write. June 17th. The effects of the serum are more pronounced today. Where yesterday I was but a primitive man, still decidedly human, I am today a man with a pronounced bestial look. My forehead has receded, my jaw is heavy, with sharp pointed teeth. The change works in me every moment. I can feel it in my flesh and bones. Among other things, I am positively shaggy. The hair makes my clothes a discomfort, and I have left them completely off. I am never weary of watching my body as it changes almost before my very eyes. It is especially interesting to see how springy and flexible my joints have become, and how my feet have a tendency to turn their palms inward. This is because of the great toe, which is beginning to stand out from the others like a thumb. Excellent proof that our ancestors were tree-dwellers and could get a grip with their feet. June 18th. When I awoke on my cot this morning, my first glance was toward the mirror. It was unable to recognize myself, unable to recognize even the thing I had been last night. In the broad, coarse face, with flat nose, splayed nostrils, little beady eyes under the beetling brows, wide mouth and brutal jaws, and the hairy, hulking body. There was no reminder of what had once been Dr. Lawler. Some scholars would be frightened at the speed and effectiveness with which the serum has worked. But I can think of nothing save the triumph of science. I am stooped considerably and stand unsteadily on my legs. Not that they are not strong, but the tendency of my feet to turn inward has increased, so that I walk for the most part on the outer edges. their prehensile powers are developed too, and they can pick up objects quite easily. It is also interesting to note that my mental processes have not changed one whit. I can think as clearly and as deeply as ever. As I predicted, the serum does not affect the brain tissues, or if it does not keep them from functioning properly. I have been hungry all day. The food Brock sent to me was not sufficient, especially as regards meat, and I must send up a note with the empty dishes for him to increase the amount. June 19th. This part of the experiment will stop tomorrow, for I shall then mix and administer the counteragent. Tonight I see myself to be an eerie creature, half beast, half man. I am hard put to it to walk without supporting myself on the table and the backs of the chairs. So must our ancestors have looked when they swung down from the trees to achieve their first adventures on the ground and to conquer the world. These 5 days, what with the many notes I've taken, will provide a fitting climax for the scientist book that I contemplate. How it will astound the world! What honors and distinctions may descend upon me! Fame is mine, certainly. Fortune, if I wish it, may follow. So good night and goodbye, my primitive self yonder in the mirror. Tomorrow I shall commence the journey back to the appearance of Dr. Lawler, that I may immortalize you in all your fascinating grotesqueness. June 20th. How could I not provide against this? With all the machinery of my experimentation evidently flawless, I must forget a single item. An item maddeningly simple, maddeningly obvious, and yet a thing that has proved my undoing. Let me remain sane for a moment, and marshal the incidents as they occurred. There was not much to tell. This morning I went to my shelf of chemicals for the ingredients to compound into the counteracting serum. My hands, which of course had become clumsy and primitive, seemed to have trouble in picking up the little vials. But this did not worry me as I began the combining of my materials. 2 of them I mixed in a graduated glass and then reached for a pipette to administer the third. But my unsteady manipulation did not allow the proper proportion to flow in. I released a drop too much, and though there was a corresponding effervescence, I could see that the mixture was a failure. I poured it out and tried again, with the same result. With growing uneasiness, I made a third attempt, and again my clumsy hands failed me. Too late I realized that the mingling of the elements in the proper proportions and manner had been a task that required all the delicacy of a skilled chemist. My hands, no longer the deft, steady hands of Dr. Lawler, were those of a subhuman creature, and as such, not equal to the feat. Horrible! Horrible! I moaned aloud when I realized what had happened and what would follow. Without the counteragent, I could not neutralize, or even halt, the progress of the deteriorator. Down I must go, back along the road up which the human race has struggled for untold centuries. Again and again I desperately tried to mix the dose, until I had used up all my materials. Once or twice I thought I had approximated the proper mingling, but when I injected it, there was no effect. I sit here tonight, a rung farther toward the beast from whence we sprang, instead of on the road back toward man. Like one lowered into a well, I see above me a circle of light growing smaller and dimmer as I descend into darkness and horror. What shall I do? From this point forward, the journal is written in an almost unintelligible scrawl. June 24th. For 3 days I have not written. I have not slept, and have eaten only when the pangs of hunger roused me from my half-trance of misery. Horror has closed over my head like water. At first I searched frantically for more materials for the counteragent, literally wrecking my laboratory, but to no avail. I had used it all in trying to mix the saving dose 3 days ago. Today was to have been the last day of my experiment. Perhaps the servants will force the lock if I do not come out. And then? I can never make them understand I have no more power of speech than any other beast, for a beast I have surely become. I cannot bear to look in the mirror, for I see only a dark, hairy form, hunched over the table, a pencil clutched in its paw. And that is I, James Lawler. What wonder that I border on the edge of insanity? Let whoever reads these words take warning from my plight. Do not meddle with the scheme of things as nature has planned. Delve not into her mysterious past. I have done that, and it was my complete and dreadful undoing. If it had not come in this way, it would have come in another. I do not doubt for a moment. June 25th. Morning. I have not budged from the chair where I sat to write last evening. I heard Brock's voice outside the door, asking me if I was coming out. I dared not make a sound in reply, and he went away. Is existence bearable in such a condition? Even now the sliding back into lower and lower form continues. It will not be long before I am no longer even the ape thing I appear. Perhaps the serum will carry me back through the ages until I am the slimy sea crawler from which all life had its beginning. Oh, God! And as if in answer to that name comes the memory of what still remains in a drawer of my table. Arsenic. Not an easy death, but a quick one. So shall I die, for if ever a creature was justified in taking its own life, that creature is myself. I will leave this journal as an account of what has happened, and as a warning to others. The formulas for my serum, and all that pertains to them, I will destroy. Never shall another scientist meet with my fate, if I can order it otherwise. There. The papers are now flaming in the grate. Now for the arsenic. So much in a glass of water. Farewell. Here the journal ends.
Shorty's strange tale is When the Dead Return by Percy B. Pryor. Without a doubt, it is very disconcerting to meet a dead man, particularly if he chances to have been your husband. In the circumstance, it is no wonder that Marion screamed. As it was midday and on Broadway, the scream attracted a good deal of attention, and, with one exception, everyone in the vicinity rushed toward Marion, who was charming enough to merit the fullest sympathy. The one exception walked quickly around the corner of John Street and vanished. He had reason for doing this. He was a dead man. Normally, Marion might have thought there had been some mistake regarding her late husband's demise. But this was hardly possible. He had died in bed, and in her presence. Furthermore, the medical man, Dr. Henry Delaware, who had also been present, could doubtless swear that the dead man had shuffled off his mortal coil. Marion was 22 when she became a widow. It was a year later when she screamed on Broadway, and by that time she was no longer Mrs. Creed, relict of the late Mark Creed. She had become Mrs. James Turner. That was one reason why her scream had such a stricken note. It became really embarrassing to encounter a dead husband when one has no further use for him. What made the matter more disconcerting, and argued against the chance of delusion or of the dead man's having a double, was the fact that the newspapers had recently contained a number of circumstantial accounts of dead people having been seen. There was a veritable epidemic of apparitions. A psychic committee had formed itself to collate and record the evidence, and had investigated such incidents as that of Arthur Johnson, aged 24, who had died suddenly in a public city park. Some 6 months later, he had been seen by both his mother and sister near their residence, and when they had tried to speak to him, he had fled and boarded a streetcar post-haste. Then there was Mrs. Tumley, seen by her son leaving her favorite seat in a well-known New York picture palace. He had tried to trace her in the crowd, but had failed. That was 4 months after her death. Strangest of all, however, was the case of Felix Mulhauer, the French chef, who had been fatally stabbed in the neck by Henry Marzot, a malicious deed for which Marzot went to the electric chair. Some 7 months had elapsed when a man convincingly identified as Mulhauer, and having a scar on his neck exactly similar to the fatal wound, was arrested for vagrancy. He swore that he was not Mulhauer, but would give no particulars of himself. One point of doubt in this case was the fact that the arrested man had a scar on his chest, whereas no such mark was mentioned in the description of the deceased Mulhauer. With these circumstances in mind, it was not surprising that Marion Turner screamed when she caught sight of her dead first husband, who she had married when she was 18, and whose dog-like devotion she had found irritating rather than otherwise, and whom she had done her best to forget since she had been married to her wonderful James Turner. The instant she screamed, however, she realized that the position contained embarrassments, so when the passers-by crowded around her, she apologized. "It's all right," she explained. "I'm sorry to be so silly, but I was sure that car was going to run over that little child." And she pointed to the scene of the fictitious narrow escape. That evening she told her husband of the apparition, and together they consulted Dr. Delaware as to possible prenatal effects of such shock on a child-to-be. He reassured them, but they were still a little troubled as to the legal status of children if dead first husbands were going to make a practice of returning to life. It was at the same time that the authorities, in further investigation of the Mulhauer affair, decided to exhume the murdered man's body. The grave was opened. It contained an empty coffin. Mulhauer was missing. This made it look as if Marzot had been executed under false pretenses, though it was admittedly rather late to make amends. Even after this, the arrested vagrant still denied that he was the dead man, and he was released after a short detention. Thereupon he vanished. Following this exhumation, the undertaking firm of Interments, Inc., which had carried out the last rites on the murdered man, was interviewed by Detective Bowler, who had charge of the case. Mr. Marlowe, who seemed to be the whole firm, could offer no explanation. But it so chanced that this Mr. Marlowe was unpopular among the undertaking fraternity. A short while previously, he had been struggling along, small, suburban, and mostly bankrupt. Then, without apparent reason, he had burst forth in a blaze of advertisements as Interments, Inc., and had taken a large establishment in the heart of New York. It was then that he became unpopular. He gave cut rates for funerals, and a fastidious competitor even remarked that he would next be introducing a cash-and-carry system to the profession. This unpopularity led to gossip, and it was then noticed that quite a number of the alleged apparitions were of people who had been inanimate patrons of Interments, Inc. That fact, combined with Mulhauer's empty coffin, furthered the police investigation and eventually established the fact that not merely several, but every one of the apparitions had been buried by Interments, Inc. Among other people interviewed by Detective Bowler during these inquiries was Maria Turner, not because there was any suspicion that she had seen her dead husband, but because his funeral had left the mortuary chapel of Interment, Inc., instead of his late residence. Mrs. Turner stated that she had actually desired the cortege to leave the house, but that Mr. Marlowe had been so insistent that in the end she had agreed to its leaving his premises. Following this, Detective Bowler consulted the Registry of Companies and found that Marlowe was only a nominal shareholder in the firm, virtually all the shares being in the name of one Henry Delaware, medical practitioner. Before doing anything further, the officer decided to consult his chief. But about 11 o'clock that night, a telephone message asked him to call immediately at the residence of Mr. James Turner. There he heard that Mrs. Turner had seen her first husband, supposed to be dead, as a very substantial apparition on Broadway a few days previously. Also that a second apparition had occurred scarcely an hour since. Mr. Turner, explaining this, stated that he and his wife had retired about 10 o'clock, but had not switched off the light. It was a sultry evening, and although the blinds were drawn, one window had been left open. Suddenly, Mrs. Turner had screamed and pointed to this window. Her husband looked quickly around, had seen the blind move. Jumping up, he had rushed outside to see a figure vanishing through the side gate. But though he gave chase, the figure eluded him. The morning papers recorded nothing of this. They had something more startling. Mysterious crime. Dr. Delaware murdered. Assailant attempts suicide. The details showed that the doctor had received an urgent call toward midnight at his residence, and going down had admitted someone to his surgery. A few minutes later, his wife had heard a strange voice, loud and angry, and 2 shots had immediately followed. Running downstairs, she found the doctor lying on the floor, dead, and a strange man lying beside him with a terrible wound in his neck. The doctor had been shot through the heart. Detective Bowler, it was stated, had the case in hand. The evening papers were able to go one better and printed verbatim, in cold official phrases, the dying deposition of the wounded man, who had since succumbed. My name is Mark Creed. About a year ago I died. That is, I became unconscious and awoke to find Dr. Delaware standing beside an operating table on which I was securely strapped. He had previously been attending me in my home. He told me I had died and that he had brought me back to life. He made me swear that I would not reveal myself to anyone, not even my wife. He said his experiments must be secret for a while yet. He said he would not let me live unless I promised. I promised. After that, he treated me for about 6 months in a sanatorium. It took about an hour's ride to get to it. I don't know where it was. The car was closed. When he discharged me from there, he made me promise again that I would not see my wife. He told me she had married again, and that she was now very happy. A few days ago I saw her on Broadway. After that I could not keep my promise. I loitered about the house, hoping to see her. Last night I peeped beneath the window blind. That made me mad. They saw me, and a man gave chase. I got away among some trees. I then went to Dr. Delaware. I cursed him. I cursed him for bringing me back to a life of torment. Then I shot him. The man had died almost immediately after signing this statement. Subsequent investigation at the doctor's surgery seemed to confirm quite clearly that he had been resuscitating the dead, apparently by a hypodermic injection of some unknown drug soon after death, followed by a surgical operation and actual massage of the heart, probably under electrical impetus. The reason for his association with Internments, Inc. is plain. He had financed the company and attracted business by reduced rates in order to get possession of subjects for his experiments, one of the most grisly business associations on record. The various apparitions were thus explained, and some strange reunions resulted, but they are not likely to recur. Dr. Delaware's astounding secret died with him, and Marion Turner, at least, will probably agree that it is just as well. A dead husband is such an embarrassing thing to be at large. Ye Good Old Ghost Story by William A.P. White. "But there ain't no such thing," said Jed Hoskins' old man forcefully. "No such thing as what?" queried the stranger with the black bag, who had just seated himself near the group. "Haunts," Jed hastened to explain. "Granddad Miller there, he says the old Lawrence house is haunted. And my dad, he said it can't be, 'cause there ain't no haunts." "Aren't there, though?" said the stranger, half to himself. "You believe there be, don't you?" said Granddad Miller hopefully. "Yes, I do. I had a horrible experience once over in England." "England?" This was Jed, who thought it a place only geography teachers could be familiar with. England it was. Would you like to hear about it? "Yes," came a chorus of assent, even from Old Man Hoskins. All right. And so he began. It must have been about 2 years ago that Lord Fathomheath invited me to spend a weekend at Fathomheath Fields, his ancestral domain. I accepted with pleasure and promptly forgot all about it. I was to have left London on well, I don't exactly remember the train, but it was something about noon on Friday. I didn't remember my engagement until about 6 Friday evening. Then I hurried down, lo más pronto posible. "Lo Mass," said Granddad Miller, the only Catholic in Higginsville. "Lo más pronto posible." It's a Spanish phrase meaning as quick as possible. "Oh!" Percy, that is, Lord Fathomheath. A gasp of surprise went around. A man who could call a lord by his first name was awfully angry at my being late. "Harry," he said, "if we weren't such good friends, I'd cut you altogether." "Well, Percy," said I, "as long as you don't cut me all apart, that's all right." "But that's just what might happen," he explained. "If you stay, you will have to sleep in the chilling chamber, otherwise known as the Bloody Bedroom. It was there that my revered ancestor, Lord Felix of Fathomheath, committed suicide by slitting his throat with a razor. Since then, every guest that has slept in the beastly boudoir has been found the next morning with his throat cut." A shiver ran around the little circle, even though the fire was blazing gaily away. "D'you sleep there?" asked Bob Hill. Of course. Would I be afraid of a ghost of a long-dead Englishman? Never. So Piercy had Barracks the butler show me upstairs to the horrible haunt of the suicidal spirit. Feeling marvelous, I began to dress for dinner. Now, if it hadn't been for Piercy's sister Alicia, it might never have happened. But I was hopeful of persuading her someday to marry me. She was pretty, rich, and of one of England's best families. Can you blame me? I'd already shaved once that day, but the thought of Alicia inspired me to shave twice in one day, for the first time in 5 years. I had lathered my face and was all set to begin, Then I saw in the mirror a horrible form at the other end of the room. It was absolutely and indescribably horrible. It was one of those things that are unmentionable, that should not be. It had a slight semblance of human form, but it was horribly distorted. It was unholy, sacrilegious. It was not healthful for a man to see such things. Slowly, it advanced on me. I was helpless, spellbound, standing there motionless with a razor in my hand. An arm appeared from nowhere on the shape, seemingly projected like the pseudopod of a protozoan. "Like the which of a what?" asked Jed. Never mind. Anyway, an arm appeared. The thing was standing directly behind me. Slowly it reached out and seized my hand. I could not move. Still more slowly, it drew my own razor, in my own hand, across my throat. "But you're not dead," Bob Hill objected. "How come?" "Wait a moment and you'll see." I came into Alicia's arms. She was supporting me while Barracks poured brandy down my throat to revive me. "My hero!" cried Alicia. "You've freed the family of its curse. It has been foretold that if anybody survived the gruesome ghost's attack, the ghost, of course, would never be able to appear again." "Alicia," I said, "I claim but one reward. Will you marry me?" And Barracks discreetly turned his head. And so we lived happily ever after. "But I don't see," Hill reiterated, "how come it didn't kill you?" Very, very simple. "But how?" "I was using a safety razor. Now, gentlemen," he went on, opening the black bag, "I have here a very fine assortment of Burnham triplex safety razors at very reasonable prices.